The sun hung low over the farmlands of Lower Saxony, casting long shadows across the rows of winter wheat. The earth smelled of damp soil and smoke that didn't come from a chimney, but from the distant front lines where the world was tearing itself apart. For Heinrich Bauer, the farm was all he had left. The war had taken everything else: his brothers to the army, his father to illness, and his peace to the sound of marching boots that echoed through the village every morning. Heinrich was a farmer, not a fighter. His hands knew the shape of tools, not weapons, the weight of soil, not rifles. Yet, as the Reich demanded more from its people, grain, livestock, and loyalty, he found himself forced to choose between survival and defiance. It began with a knock at his door one cold February morning in 1943. Two soldiers in gray uniforms stood on his porch, their breath forming small clouds in the freezing air. One of them, a young lieutenant with sharp eyes, handed him a paper. "By order of the Wehrmacht, your land will assist in supplying the front. You will deliver 2 carts of grain each week. Non-compliance will be treated as treason." The words burned into Heinrich's mind long after the soldiers were gone. Treason. It was a word thrown around like seed, and it grew quickly in fear. But what they didn't know was that Heinrich's fields hid more than roots, they hid men. It had started months earlier, when he found the first one. A wounded German soldier, half-conscious, slumped behind the barn, his uniform torn and his insignia stripped. He wasn't just any soldier. He was young, barely 20, and his accent was Polish. A conscript. He whispered his name, Jakub, and begged for water. Heinrich saw the fear in his eyes, the kind that didn't come from cowardice but from being caught between two flags that both demanded his loyalty. Heinrich didn't think twice. He carried Jakub to the hayloft, bandaged his wounds, and kept him hidden. It was dangerous, foolish even, but something in him refused to hand over a boy who looked barely old enough to drive a plow. For weeks, Jakub helped with small chores when the soldiers weren't around. He fed the chickens, patched fences, and repaired the old iron plow that had been in Heinrich's family for generations. The plow was rusted, its handle cracked, but Jakub worked on it as if it were a sacred thing. "You take care of this like it's a soldier," Heinrich said once, half smiling. Jakub looked up from the metal and replied softly, "Maybe it is. Maybe it fights for life instead of death." The words stayed with Heinrich. The plow, an instrument of life, of growth, became a symbol in his mind, a quiet defiance against the machinery of war. By summer, more soldiers began appearing, not Germans, but deserters, escaped prisoners, even downed Allied airmen. Heinrich's farm, tucked between the forest and the hills, became a haven. The barn's false floor hid a dugout where he kept food, blankets, and tools. Jakub helped him build it, both men working through the night, driven by a shared understanding. Survival was no longer just about living, it was about preserving humanity in a world that had forgotten it. Each morning, Heinrich went about his routine as though nothing had changed. He plowed, sowed, harvested, while beneath his feet, men lay hidden, breathing the damp air of the earth. His neighbors suspected nothing. The Gestapo visited the village often, searching for anyone, harboring enemies of the Reich. But Heinrich's stoic nature made him invisible. To the world, he was just another farmer, too simple to cause trouble. Then came the day that tested everything. A truck rolled into the yard, its engine growling like a beast. 2 officers stepped out, one of them, the same lieutenant from before. His eyes were colder now. "Bauer," he barked, "there's been reports of deserters in this region. You will allow us to search your property." Heinrich's heart pounded so hard he thought they could hear it. He nodded calmly. "Of course. I have nothing to hide." Jakub and the others were below, under the barn floor. Heinrich had warned them. If soldiers ever came, silence was their only weapon. The lieutenant walked through the farmhouse, his boots heavy on the wooden floor. He opened cupboards, kicked at sacks of grain, peered into the loft. Then he moved toward the barn. Heinrich followed, his palms slick with sweat. The barn smelled of hay and soil, and something else. A faint trace of bread and stew from the hidden space below. Heinrich prayed the officer's nose wouldn't catch it. The lieutenant tapped the old iron plow with his boot. "Still using this relic?" Heinrich forced a smile. "It's all I've got. My father's plow. Still works if you've got the arms for it." The officer chuckled. You farmers and your traditions. You think this iron can feed an army? Heinrich shrugged. It feeds men, not soldiers. The lieutenant paused, then smirked. Careful with your words, Bauer. They left after 2 hours. Heinrich stood in the yard until the sound of the truck faded down the road. Then he rushed to the barn, lifted the hatch, and whispered, "They're gone." Jakub emerged first, covered in dirt but smiling faintly. "You have nerves of steel," he said. Heinrich sat on the plow, his hands trembling. "No," he whispered, "just iron." That night, the farm seemed quieter than ever. The stars above looked cold and distant. Heinrich lay awake, thinking about how fragile his world had become. One wrong word, one sound too loud, and everything would be over. Yet, for all his fear, he felt a strange strength inside him. The iron plow stood by the barn door, its blade glinting faintly in the moonlight, like a silent guardian. Over the months, the group under his protection grew. There was Emile, a French resistance courier shot down near the border, Tomas, a Czech mechanic, and Anna, a nurse who had escaped a transport convoy. Each carried their own scars, their own reasons to fight. Heinrich's farm became more than a refuge, it became a small world bound by trust, fear, and the stubborn will to survive. They dug trenches by night, turning them into hiding spots camouflaged with crops. The iron plow was used to mask the disturbed earth. Its heavy blade cut through the soil like a weapon of salvation. Whenever Heinrich pushed it forward, he felt as if he were carving a message into the ground. Life still grows here. Winter came again, harsher than before. The war was turning against Germany. Rumors spread. Defeats on the Eastern Front, Allied landings in Italy. The soldiers who once walked proudly through the village now looked gaunt and desperate. Some whispered that even Hitler couldn't stop what was coming. One morning, as Heinrich and Jakub worked in the field, they heard the distant rumble of artillery. Jakub stopped and looked toward the horizon. "It's getting closer," he said. Heinrich nodded. "Then we have less time to hide and more to hope." That night, snow began to fall. The barn roof creaked under its weight. Heinrich was inside, mending a harness, when a knock came again at the door. But this time, it wasn't soldiers, it was a woman with a child, both covered in frost. She spoke little German, but Heinrich understood enough. They were Jews who had escaped a nearby camp. Without hesitation, he brought them inside. Jakub gave the child his coat. The woman wept, not from sorrow, but disbelief that someone still had kindness left. The next morning, the world changed again. A column of German troops came. Retreating through the valley, their trucks overloaded. The lieutenant was among them, his uniform dirt-stained, his face drawn with exhaustion. He stopped by Heinrich's gate once more. "Bauer," he said, voice hoarse, "the war is ending. The Russians are coming from the east. Burn your papers, hide your valuables. No one will be safe." Heinrich simply nodded. "What about you?" The lieutenant looked at the fields, then at the plow. "Men like me have nowhere left to hide." He turned and walked away, leaving deep footprints in the snow. In the weeks that followed, the front collapsed. The sound of artillery grew louder until one day, silence returned, the kind of silence that comes after a storm. When the first Allied patrols reached the village, they found Heinrich in his fields, pushing the iron plow through thawing soil. His clothes were worn, his hands rough, but his eyes were steady. A British officer approached him, confused by the sight of a man farming in the ruins of war. "You worked through all of this?" he asked. Heinrich stopped, leaned on the plow, and replied, "The land doesn't wait for peace. It needs to be ready when it comes." Behind the barn, the soldiers discovered the dugout and the people he had hidden. They were weak but alive. When the officer realized what Heinrich had done, he removed his cap. "You've saved more lives than some soldiers," he said quietly. Heinrich looked at the iron plow beside him, its blade dull from years of toil. "No," he said, "this did. It taught me to dig deep, even when the ground was frozen." After the war, the fields of Lower Saxony bloomed again. The soil, once scarred by boots and blood, returned to what it had always been, a place for life. Heinrich kept the plow, though he never used it again. He placed it at the edge of the farm, near the old oak tree, where sunlight struck it each morning. Jakub stayed with him for a while before returning to Poland. On the day he left, he touched the plow and said, "This iron saved us all." Years later, when Heinrich was an old man, children would ask him about the war. He would tell them not of battles or heroes, but of soil, seeds, and an iron plow that refused to rust. He would say, "War turns men into weapons. But the land, if you care for it, turns iron into hope." The plow stood there long after he was gone, half buried by grass, silent yet unyielding. It had never drawn blood, never fired a shot. But in its own way, it had fought the greatest battle of all, the battle to keep life alive when the world had forgotten what that meant. And when spring came, as it always did, the fields whispered their answer through the wind and the wheat, that even in war, something as simple as an iron plow could become an ally, not just to soldiers, but to humanity itself.